The Model 20 transfer case is a manually shifted 4-position gearbox that has been used in many Jeep vehicles over the years. It is now utilized in all 4-wheel drive Jeeps equipped with standard transmissions, whereas the Quadra-Track unit is used with automatics. The purpose of this film is to familiarize you with the operational characteristics and service requirements of the Model 20. The theory of operation behind the Model 20 is pretty straightforward, as we'll see in a minute. Therefore, the greater portion of this film is dedicated to step-by-step disassembly and reassembly procedures. All of these procedures are also included in the flip chart that accompanies the film. After you've viewed the film, you can use the flip chart as a quick reference source when you're servicing a Model 20 transfer case. The Model 20 offers 3 driving ranges and 1 neutral range. As you can see here, CJ models use a certain shift pattern, while Cherokee and truck models use another. 2 high is used for normal driving situations where 4-wheel drive is not needed. In this range, the transfer case provides direct drive to the rear axle. When 4-wheel drive is needed at moderate speeds, the 4 high range is used. In this range, the transfer case passes drive power to both axles, but the 1-to-1 gear ratio is maintained. The 4 low range provides a gear reduction ratio of about 2-to-1. This low range is handy for off-road use and situations that require increased pulling power. The neutral range is used for stationary power takeoff applications. Obviously, power is supplied only to the power takeoff unit and not to the drive axles. Let's take a look at what's happening in the various ranges. The red arrows represent power flow. Here, the case is in the neutral range. The transfer case main shaft gear is splined to the transmission main shaft. The main shaft gear is not locked to the rear output shaft, so the rear output shaft isn't turning. The main shaft gear passes the drive power to the intermediate gear, which passes the power to the front output shaft gear. Because the front output shaft gear is not locked to the front output shaft, the front output shaft isn't turning. Here's how the power gets to the rear wheels when 2 high is engaged. The rear output shaft sliding gear is moved forward until it locks with the main shaft gear. The sliding gear is splined to the rear output shaft, so power is passed to the rear axle. Here's how this locking action is achieved. As you can see here, both the main shaft gear and the rear output shaft sliding gear have locking cogs. Remember, when the case is in the neutral range, the main shaft gear turns with the transmission main shaft. But because the main shaft gear isn't locked to the rear output shaft via the sliding gear, the rear output shaft doesn't turn. When the case is shifted into the 2 high range, the sliding gear, which is moved forward by a shift fork, locks to the main shaft gear and passes power to the rear output shaft. Now the case has been shifted into 4 high. Note that the rear output shaft components stay in the same positions we saw in 2 high. But now, the front output shaft sliding gear has been moved forward and locked to the front output shaft gear. Now the drive power is passed to both output shafts, still at a 1-to-1 gear ratio. When the case is shifted into the 4 low position, both sliding gears are pushed rearward until they mesh with the intermediate gear. The main shaft gear transmits power to the intermediate gear. The intermediate gear passes the power to both sliding gears. So now the drive power is passed to both output shafts at a 2-to-1 reduction ratio. As we saw earlier, CJ models use a certain shift pattern, while Cherokee and truck models use another. If you follow these patterns, you'll have no trouble shifting into the various ranges. There is one point that's important to keep in mind regarding Cherokee and truck models. These models utilize a U-shaped shift pattern. When you're shifting between 2 high and 4 low, It's important that you use one continuous motion. First, make sure you slow down to about 5 miles per hour. Then depress the clutch and make your shift. If you pause or hesitate while crossing the base of the U, you might find that the shifter resists movement. If this happens, go back to too high and try again. Here's another important driving tip. If you're shifting from four-wheel drive back to two-wheel drive, it's a good idea to do what our buddy's doing here. Come to a complete stop, then back up a few feet. While you're backing up, slowly depress the clutch and shift into the too-high range. This procedure overcomes the effects of prop shaft wind-up and makes shifting a lot smoother. When any vehicle equipped with a Model 20 transfer case is towed, certain precautions must be taken. If the correct precautionary measures are taken, the vehicle can be towed with all four wheels on the road or with the front or rear wheels raised. If you're towing a vehicle with all the wheels on the ground, place both the transmission and the transfer case in their neutral positions. Also, if the vehicle is equipped with locking hubs, make sure they're in the lock position. If the front wheels are raised, use the same procedure. Put the transmission and transfer case in neutral and lock the hubs. Towing speed must not exceed 30 miles per hour, and the vehicle must not be towed for more than 15 miles. If the rear wheels are raised, the same procedures are used. Remember, do not exceed 30 miles per hour, and don't tow the vehicle farther than 15 miles. Here's another important point: checking the lubricant level of the Model 20. Some Model 20 cases share lubricant with the transmission, others do not. To be safe, always check the lubricant level at the transmission and at the transfer case, as shown in these photos. Check both levels and correct as is necessary. Now let's run through the procedures involved in the disassembly of the Model 20. We'll cover a complete teardown in this film. Remember, though, that many service procedures involve only partial disassembly. If you're performing a particular fix, consult the Jeep Technical Service Manual for that specific procedure. After you've drained the lubricant from the case and removed the case from the vehicle, remove the bottom cover. Next, check the end play of the front output shaft with a dial indicator. Make sure the case is in the neutral or 4-low position. Then zero the dial indicator. Use a screwdriver to force the front output shaft gear to the rear as far as it will go. Finally, place the screwdriver in the position shown here. Using the sliding gear for leverage, force the front output shaft gear forward. The end play will register on the indicator at this point. Check the Technical Service Manual for the correct specification. Now, remove the rear bearing cap bolts. With these bolts removed, you can remove the entire rear output shaft assembly and check the rear output shaft end play. Set the assembly on its end. Zero the gauge, then lift up on the bearing cap. Now take a reading. Be sure to check the Technical Service Manual for the correct specification. Using pliers, remove the two shift rod thimbles. Remove the intermediate shaft lock plate. As you can see, the lock plate bears the case's identification numbers. With the lock plate removed, you can remove the intermediate shaft. Simply tap the shaft out the rear of the case using the special tool shown here as a driver. After you've removed the intermediate shaft, you can remove the intermediate gear. Shown here are the spacers for the gear's needle bearings. Be sure that you don't lose these spacers. Here you can see several of the protruding needle bearings. If you leave the special tool in place while the unit is disassembled, the bearings are less likely to fall out of the gear and get lost. These are the intermediate gear thrust washers. Remove these from the case and set them aside. Use an Allen wrench or socket to remove the set screw from the rear output shaft shift fork. Move the rear output shaft shift rod forward until the fork will slide off of the rod. The fork and the rear output shaft sliding gear can both be removed at this point. You can now remove the rear output shaft shift rod. But be sure to hold your thumb over the hole in the front bearing cap. The shift rod poppet ball and spring will eject from this hole as the rod is removed. Both the ball and spring could cause injury to you or anyone else in the area if they are not held inside the cap. Remove the front output shaft cover plate bolts, then remove the cover plate. These shims, which are positioned inside the cover plate, control the front output shaft end play. We'll discuss these more when we cover assembly procedures. Use the special tool shown here and a socket and breaker bar to remove the front output shaft yoke nut. With the nut removed, the yoke can also be removed. Remove the front output shaft seal using this special tool. Behind the seal, you'll find this spacer for the bearing. Remove this spacer and set it aside. Remove the front bearing cap bolts, but do not remove the cover yet. There is also a poppet ball and spring for the front output shaft shift rod located within the cap. As you remove the cap, be sure to hold a finger over the hole as shown here to prevent the ball and spring from causing injury. Use a brass drift and hammer to drive the front output shaft out of the case. When the front output shaft is removed, you can remove the output shaft gear and sliding gear. The bearing and bearing spacer can also be removed now. If you're going to replace the bearing, remove the front bearing cup also. Now remove the set screw from the shift fork. Then remove the shaft and the shift fork from the case. At this point, remove the yoke nut from the rear output shaft. With the yoke removed, you can inspect all of the rear output shaft components. Here's an important point regarding gear replacements. If you're replacing gears, be absolutely sure to order each gear by its part number. This is critical because each gear is specifically matched to its counterpart intermediate gear. Therefore, the tooth design and other specs must be the same. After you've completely inspected all of the components, you're ready to begin reassembly. Assemble the rear output shaft components in the proper order. Tighten the rear output shaft yoke nut. Install the front output shaft shift rod and fork. Tighten the set screw. Then lock the front output shaft gear to the sliding gear and position both gears in the case. Be sure that the shift fork falls into place on the sliding gear collar. Install the front output shaft in the case. Be sure to install the bearing spacer for the front output shaft front bearing. Then, install the bearing on the front output shaft. Now, use the yoke nut, and special tool to press the bearing back into place on the front output shaft. Next, install the front and rear bearing cups. This photo illustrates the method used to install the poppet ball and spring for the front output shaft shift rod. First, as shown on the left here, position the cap over the shift rod while you hold the spring in place with the punch. Then let the cap drop until the shift rod retains the spring. Drop the poppet ball onto the top of the shift rod. Lift the bearing cap until you can push the ball into the cavity, compressing the spring. Finally, drop the cap so that the shift rod retains both the ball and the spring. From here, you can let the cap drop down into its normal position. Tighten the front bearing cap bolts. Drop the bearing spacer into place. Use this special tool to install a new front output shaft seal. Install the front output shaft yoke, then the yoke nut and washer. Now install the shims and front output shaft cover plate. Be sure to put a new gasket on the cover plate. Always install the same number of shims that you removed, even if you replaced some components. Tighten the cover plate bolts. Install the poppet ball and spring, and while holding them in place with a punch, insert the shift rod for the rear output shaft fork. Install the rear output shaft sliding gear. Install the shift fork on the rod and tighten the set screw. Coat the intermediate shaft thrust washers with grease and position them in the case. The grease will help them stay in place until the gear is installed. With the special tool in place, install the 2 intermediate gear spacers. Position the intermediate gear in the case. As you tap the intermediate shaft into place, the special tool will be drawn out the front of the case. By using this method, you'll be sure that the needle bearings stay in position. Tighten the intermediate lock plate into position. Then tap the 2 shift rail thimbles into place. If you've installed any new components in the rear output shaft assembly, be sure to recheck the end plate. If it is not within specs, remove or add shims as is necessary. Then install a new gasket. Reinstall the assembly in the transfer case. Likewise, if you've replaced any of the front output shaft components, or if your original reading was not within specs, recheck the end plate. Add or subtract shims if your reading is not within specs. Install a new bottom cover gasket. Finally, install the bottom cover. Here's a procedure which can also be performed with the case in the vehicle. Replacement of shift rod oil seals. You can remove the old seals with the special tool shown here. Then use this special tool to drive the new seals into place. Well, that's it. As you can see, the Model 20 transfer case is not only functional and durable, but it's also pretty easy to service. Remember to hang on to the handy flip chart that accompanies this film for future reference. In addition to the film and flip chart, this Model 20 training package also includes a wall chart with exploded illustrations of the transfer case and both types of shifter assemblies. Be sure to consult the technical service manual for the specific steps involved in vehicle service procedures when complete disassembly isn't required.